Thank you all. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about some stuff that's in a very different part of the world and at a very different time frame. I want to say straight up that this is part of one small part of a larger project, and the person who led this part of it is my student Caitlin Ainsworth, who was not able to be here, which is why I'm presenting this paper today instead. I will do my best to be a substitute for Caitlin, but it's a hard thing to do. This is part of a larger project that I am leading that has to do with the Columbian Exchange, what's often called the Columbian Exchange in New Mexico. And particularly in the central part of New Mexico. So what we're interested in is the socio-environmental consequences of the increased exchange that happened post-1492. And we are looking at this, and we're working with people across the Americas, but we're focusing on the state of New Mexico and central New Mexico for a number of reasons. One of them is that we live there, we're based there, but another is that this is a place that I think is actually, it's a really productive place to look at these kinds of questions just because of the nature of the history of colonization and contact there. So I'm starting this with the assumption that most people here don't know very much about New Mexico. And if that's the case, don't feel bad. This is true. Most Americans don't know much about New Mexico either. In fact, it's a standing local joke. This features on a t-shirt, New Mexico, not really new and not really Mexico. So I'll try and give you a very brief overview. And this is why we think it's such a great place to look into questions dealing with the Columbian Exchange. New Mexico went through waves of different kinds of contact between local indigenous people and Europeans who eventually settled. So it was initially part of New Spain. There was an entrada that happened in 1540, but initial Spanish colonizations began in 1598 with an establishment of a colony in the northern part of the state in Santa Fe. So we had this discrete period of Spanish colonization up to 1680. There was a revolt. The Spanish were expelled from the state. They came back in 1692 when we had the post-revolt Spanish colonial period. Following Mexican independence, New Mexico was part of Mexico, and then associated with the Mexican-American War, New Mexico became part of the U.S., but it was a territory and not a state up until 1912, which meant that it was very isolated. And in fact, throughout its history, New Mexico was actually pretty isolated. It was on the fringes of the Spanish Empire, it was on the fringes of Mexico, and then it was on the fringes of the US. And a real big change that happened that brought it closer was the arrival of the railroad in 1880. So this map over here, annoyingly, the state outlines aren't really showing up on it. What I'm trying to show you here is that Albuquerque is really in the center of the state. And part of the reason that we're focusing there is that both from a geological standpoint or a physiogeographic standpoint, as well as today a transportation standpoint, it really is kind of right at the cross. It's in the center. So we have the Rio Grande running north to south, and then we have a passage through mountains on either to the east, running east and west, and Albuquerque is kind of right in the middle of it. Okay, so this is a view of from the west looking east of Albuquerque in the last few years. And what I'm trying to illustrate with this is that today, Albuquerque is a fairly standard Western American city. It's got a lot of sprawl. So you can see here, we've got the downtown kind of in the middle. There's the Rio Grande, that's that band of green. Usually green in New Mexico indicates water. Everything else is usually pretty brown. And then we're looking over across this urban sprawl towards the Sandia Mountains. But that sprawl is a really recent phenomenon. This is an aerial photo from 1948, and it doesn't get quite the same, it doesn't have quite the same spatial coverage as did the previous one, but it's the same general direction. So you can see the Sandia Mountains, and you can see some houses, and you can see a lot of open space. Okay, so this is what Albuquerque looked like in 1948, not all that long ago. At this time, Albuquerque was still really rural. There are a lot of people who were engaged in household livestock raising. Sheep were particularly important, as they were across New Mexico. In fact, there are certain parts of Albuquerque today where you'll still see people having having herds of sheep in the backyard, but it's much smaller now than it was. From the get-go, the Europeans who came to New Mexico, and then also indigenous people began becoming engaged with livestock raising. They were really engaged in raising sheep. And sheep did provide meat for families. They were largely, though, a source of wool, which were then used for trade. And again, indigenous and Spanish, and then later Anglo folk, all were engaged in this kind of activity. This picture, by the way, really, it is within the bounds of Albuquerque. This is from the North Valley. So, and this is from the early 20th century. So just trying to, again, to reiterate that though today it is a significantly sized city, it's always had this kind of rural character as well. Folks in the region also raised cattle, and they did so. And cattle early on were primarily for meat, and they tended to be a much smaller part of the herds that people had. In the late 19th and early 20th century, folks we did get a number of dairies that got started in town, and that's what this picture is. I don't have any great historic pictures of cattle, which is why I'm stuck with kids in front of a dairy truck instead. Okay, so the introduction of all these livestock, of domestic herbivores to the West in general in the US, but to New Mexico in particular, we know that these had a fair number of environmental impacts as well as social ones. So one of the things that we know happened is there's a lot of replacement of native fauna and also flora, but I'm a little focused on the fauna, both in local landscapes. So when we look back into some of the earlier archaeological sites during the historic period, they tend to be really dominated with local native herbivores, things like deer, things like elk, things like pronghorn, and that changes really quite dramatically, where the local landscapes become populated with sheep largely, but also cattle and to a lesser extent pigs. So this happened across the landscape. You don't generally find deer in Albuquerque at this point in time. It also happened in diets, and that is something else that we've been able to track through the zooarchaeology. Associated with this came overgrazing of grasslands. And this photo is not, in fact, actually from New Mexico, but it does show what this looks like. This is showing on the left-hand side is a grassland today that's managed to be more similar to what the native grasslands look like. It's got a predominance of C4 plants, C4 grasses, and a lot of biodiversity in the flora and in the fauna as well. On the right-hand side is a pretty typical landscape, and those of you who have been to New Mexico have probably seen landscapes that look like this. It's pretty standard, where there's much less diversity, and what we have is a lot of shrubs and things that are very C4 in terms of their character. Some of the work that my students and I have been doing suggests that we didn't see this kind of environmental impact, this kind of overgrazing impact until relatively late. Initially people were arguing this happened right away. It's directly related to the introduction of sheep. So it happened in that early Spanish colonial period, 17th century. We've been looking for this in numbers of different ways, and everything that we've come up with suggests that did not happen. And so our next guess was, well, maybe this is associated with the coming of the railroad. That would be the time when there would be a real incentive to increase herd size to a point where you might start getting this kind of impact. We've been looking for evidence of that. Okay, so I just want to go, this is a little more context, just in terms of changing linkages and networks. In terms of connectivity, there was connectivity between indigenous people in different parts of what today is New Mexico prior to the Spanish coming. As far as we can tell, those linkages really broke, not until in the 18th century, really, not until that point. What we've been focusing on is later. So the primary connection through 1880 was the Camino Real, which went between Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and then down to Mexico City. So that was the main trade network. The Santa Fe Trail, which connected New Mexico to farther east in the United States, started to pick up around 1821, and again through 1880. That was the main one. This is just a picture of the kind of place that's there. I'm just going to quickly mention a site that I'm going to show you data from that dates to this time period, this late 18th through 19th century, and then we had the railroad come in 1880, which revolutionized everything, and it allowed all these connections to really intensify. It's just another image that's showing, the railroad at that time. Okay, and we have a site that dates to the period post-railroad as well. So these are homesteads in Albuquerque, again, this kind of rural character. To give you a sense of the kind of change that happens, Los Ranchos, which is the earlier one, it's dominated by sheep, the archaeofaunal assemblages, but there's actually a fair amount of other things there as well. Sheep and cattle, but we've got squirrels and rodents, chickens and turkeys, and some deer as well. North Edith Casa-Corral, which is the later one, we've got increasing numbers of cattle, still quite a lot of sheep, and a lot of the local native fauna has dropped out. Okay, so we were looking at this with a question: is there evidence of a change in the diet of domestic livestock following the arrival of the railroad? And if there is, can the change be linked to local environmental change, that is overgrazing? I should qualify, these are that the traditional way of grazing in this area would be essentially free ranging. Okay, so this isn't a situation where there was transhumance. So we did bulk collagen from a number of different taxa to try and get some kind of a baseline. And if you look on here, the triangle, this is a bit busy. I'll give you a more organized one in a moment. The triangles are from the later site. The circles are from the earlier one. And there does seem to be kind of a trend towards a more C3 signature on here, but there's a lot of overlap. And in fact, when we start looking at standard ellipse areas, that's what we see. So the blue here is the earlier site. The green is the later site. The darker shades are there's a typo on here, I think. It's kind of, nope, okay, never mind. All right, so the darker shades are the later site, the lighter shades are the earlier site. The green are cattle, and the blue is caprines. Okay, so as you can see, there is quite a bit of overlap. Most things are more on the C4 end of the graph, but there is a statistically significant difference in that the North Edith cattle do in fact have a much stronger C3 signature, and we've tested this a lot of different ways, and they do pop out as being different. So this is different than what we'd expect in terms of a general, if we were looking for general overgrazing, which as we were, there we'd expect everything from the later site to have this more C3 signal, and we're just not seeing that in these data. So what do we think is going on? We've got a couple different hypotheses about what's going on here. And I'm just going to throw two of them out there. Alfalfa really took off as a potential hay for foddering in the winter in the U.S., not in New Mexico, but in the U.S. around 1850, and that is something that is a C3 plant. So we're guessing that what might be going on here has to do, it may reflect the North Edith cattle having been foddered with alfalfa hay. Now, in New Mexico, alfalfa didn't really take off until the 20th century, so we've got a couple options. One might be that the folks at North Edith Casa-Corral were innovating and bringing in alfalfa from somewhere else. Another might be that the cattle themselves came from somewhere else and were brought in. We're still trying to figure this out. So just to sum up here, since I am getting to the end here, these data thus far, I think they do support this idea that we've got increased connectivity in the late 19th century, and that is impacting the ways in which people are raising livestock. But we don't think this is showing us much about overgrazing. And perhaps what's going on here is that this isn't the best way to get at it. So I've already had some productive suggestions from folks here about other ways to maybe get at overgrazing, possibly not through isotopes. But I would be really interested to hear any other suggestions people might have, either about these data or about other ways to get at this. And with that, I will say thank you. And there are some other people I need to thank as well.
Does anyone have any questions? I'll start with one if I may then. So have you considered perhaps trying incremental dentine work?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes it's overgrazing. If it's short term, it can get averaged out in bulk.
Yeah, so part of the problem here is we have a lack of teeth in these collections. We do have some, and so this is definitely something that I think it's definitely something that we're going to try. I'm not sure that we have the sample sizes to really get at it, though, unfortunately.
Any other ideas? Any questions?
With the modern environment and the current sheep that are hanging out and whatnot, is the modern environment sort of mostly overgrazed as well? Is there a possibility to get some modern sheep and sort of have a signature for this is what overgrazing looks like isotopically?
That is a really interesting idea, and it's one, especially with the previous presentation, talking to pastoralists in the Pyrenees. I suspect this would be a difficult group to convince, but it's possible, and it is maybe worth doing. I mean, it would be a good way to involve local community in this as well. This is that overgrazing is a problem that they are dealing with. So yeah, thank you. I think.
Julia?
I've come across this kind of problem before that you're trying to address. There was a study in the South African Karoo, which had a similar problem, and it's a rather similar period as well, I suspect, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, and carrying on. It's about overgrazing in a rather delicate kind of environment. And I have an idea that the plant scientists who were looking at this were, they did historical stock numbers, and they also did soil profiles, isotopic soil profiles. So you might think about that, because you can, I mean, the dating is pretty awful for soil profiles, but you can still show, and it matches the stock profiles.
Awesome, thank you. I will check that out, and I will see if I can track down that work in particular, because it sounds like it would be good for me to look at regardless.
Thanks for a great talk. Is there any historical evidence from this period that suggests a change in animal management through time? And I ask this because I think a lot now about rotational and mob grazing, and the concern people have about actually managing pasture. And I wonder to what extent in the past, people noticed or cared or just were leaving large numbers of animals free range in a landscape.
So this is in fact a really interesting question, and it gets into some thorny specific things about New Mexico, which have to do with ethnic groups and the way that different ethnic groups identified through their livestock management practices. So there's a traditional Hispanic graze, which would be the stuff that's a little bit earlier in the 19th century and in the late 18th century. The other thing that came with the railroad is a lot of Anglos, people moving in from eastern parts of the United States who often came in with very different ideas about how to manage livestock. I was hoping we dodged that with these two samples, just because from what we can tell, the North Edith Casa-Corral was part of this larger Hispanic community. And so probably would have been doing the same kind of grazing, but I'm worrying that in fact, what may be happening here also might have to do with people saying, "Oh, well, we've got these new people coming in with new ideas about how to manage livestock." Yeah, it's something where we've got the documents. I'm not sure I've got the documents about these sites. or about any sites that we have, but it's important.
Okay, we better move on.
All right, thank you so much.